to be able to take a break from all this stuff. Just sitting here watching some Keanu. No, Keanu, you're breathtaking. I could watch this guy all day. Oh no. Is he still here? Here he comes. Thought that I was going to leave you alone, did you? Would it surprise you if I said no? What? I... The whole point of me appearing on this screen is that I'm supposed to be annoying. Well, you are. But you're supposed to, like, be scared or something. This is like the 5th time you've appeared in these videos. I think everyone's used to your voice by now. Who? Everyone? What are you talking about? There's only you. Are you trying to suggest that your cat understands what's happening? Never mind. Are you here to help me out with the announcements today or something? As if I would read some assignments off to a bunch of kids. You have to be... What? Is that Keanu? Oh my god, it's Keanu Reeves. Oh, I love that guy. Well, at least we have something in common. Could you just be quiet for a minute and let me finish the announcements? Fine, as long as I get to pay attention to that marvelous, breathtaking man right there on the screen. I'll happily ignore you. Ah, thank God. All right. Well, the reminders for this week, pretty simple. Don't forget, guys, that I have a number of you that have a lot of past assignments to do. We need a lot of you to do your makeup work, please. One of the big issues that we're dealing with right now, especially on Edgenuity, is that a few folks have not quite caught up with our past assignments, even with time given in class. So it's very important that you start catching up with those. A few of you are falling behind by more than 1 week. Some of you are about 2 weeks behind. And we're getting to the end of the 9 weeks here, so it's very imperative that you catch up with us. The second thing is, well, I actually already have it on the list, is the Edgenuity, but I guess really the second thing is that on Edgenuity, you should be completing up through the unit test for our first unit that was American Heroes, and you should be seeing the Frederick Douglass stories appearing on your screen. If you have not gotten that far, quite honestly, you really do need to keep up. Remember that we're not going as fast on the cyber program as the full-time cyber students. I've actually been going much slower than the pace for full-time cyber. So I understand that this is challenging, that it's a lot of work, but quite honestly, if you have not caught up with us yet, you really do need to start finding more time during your cyber days when you're not in the building to discipline yourself to get on and complete some of those assignments. I mean, there's a couple folks where the unit that you needed to finish for, like, say, the active passive grammar, I mean, that unit was very short. It shouldn't have taken more than 10 or 15 minutes, and I still have some folks that have not even started it. So it's very important that we start catching up with that and getting as far as we're supposed to be so that when we come back next week, we can continue going forward. And then, of course, the last thing, of course, is that I will go over the Google Classroom work that we had for this week. So without further ado, let's go ahead and review what we have online for you to do for us and bid a farewell to our Emperor. Ooh, look, you found more of my animation and artwork that I was planning on using in the future. But anyway, looking at the more pressing matters here. So on Google Classroom, don't forget that we had a number of assignments that we started to do in class. One of the first ones that we did when you guys came in this week was the subject, predicate, object lesson. It looked just like this, and it was pretty straightforward, right? We had three worksheets that I needed you to complete for me. You remember that you were underlining your subjects, the predicates, and that only the third sheet required you to find objects. Don't forget, and I'll even zoom in on this one, when we were talking about this, don't forget that we were saying that a subject essentially is like who or what are we talking about in a sentence. Our predicate was just a verb. So remember, predicates are just verbs. That's all it means. So when I'm looking at a sentence, I'm basically asking myself, okay, what did somebody do, or what's happening? So in this case, and then finally we have objects, which are like, okay, if I have a predicate, and the kind of object we're talking about is like, say, direct object. We were saying, okay, if I have a predicate, if I have a verb, is that action doing anything to an object? And so we have a couple examples here, and I'll re-explain them in case you haven't finished this activity. So for instance, the pirate captain sang a sea shanty on his pirate ship, and so we determined, like, okay, we asked the question, Who or what is this about? Oh, it's about the pirate captain. Okay, what did the pirate captain do? Well, he sang. He did something, so that's our predicate, right? And then because this is an action verb, because sang is an actual action that the pirate took, I can then say, oh, there must be an object here, or there might be an object here. So I ask myself, what did he sing? And it's like, oh, he sang a sea shanty. So that's something he did. The object is the sea shanty, so I labeled that green. And then when we looked at the second sentence, we also talked about how, 99% of the time, usually somebody puts the subject at the front of the sentence, but this is not always the case, right? Like, for instance, in this sentence, a lot of what we talked about how this sentence isn't about singing. This sentence was about his favorite activity. So in many ways, this sentence could have been reformatted. We could have just said his favorite activity was singing, but the way they decided to do it was instead tell you what his activity was first. So they said singing was his favorite activity, but the subject is still the favorite activity. That's what we're really talking about in the sentence. We're not really discussing singing. And then of course the predicate's still the same because you're looking for a verb. Now this was the other issue that would come up when you're looking for predicates. So if you're still working on this assignment, please make sure you pay attention to the fact that words like was, is, are, am, will, be, all those things are actually verbs, and we typically ignore them because we just don't, we always see a verb as just an action. It's like, oh, a verb is an action, a verb is an action. And that's not totally true. That's only half of the story, right? If you look at number 3, a lot of people would tell me that feeding or swashbuckling and pillaging is the verb. And in reality, in this sentence, the verb is liked, which again is not an action, but it's a status. It's a state of being. So remember that verbs are actually usually can be broken down to 2 things. They're either an action, like an actual thing that I did, or they are an indication of my status, like my state of being. I was there, indicating that in the past you could have found me at some location, or I am, intelligent. Okay, so I'm giving you my status as far as, mental acuity or something like that. I liked cake. That's just a status, right? So any words that indicate a status that I have, those are also verbs, even though they're not actions. So make sure you're looking for those when you're trying to indicate your predicates. Now, of course, if I have what we call a linking verb, like a status verb, basically, usually that also means then that I do not have an object because, the word was isn't an action, so there is no direct object that I can affect with my status. Or if I liked something, well, that something isn't being affected by my liking it, right? The other thing we talked about in this activity is that words that end in ing are not always verbs. So especially in this last worksheet here, when you're looking through stuff, remember that just because it ends in ing does not mean it is a verb. Sometimes it is what we call a gerund, or a participle. I mean, there's all kinds of terms that we could use for it, but you're never going to remember those terms. The real gist of it is you have to check to make sure that they are actually using it as a verb, or if they're just describing an activity. So to get back to our number 3 example, swashbuckling in this case is being used to indicate an activity, but if you look at the sentence, he also liked feeding his parrot, swashbuckling, and pillaging. It's really just talking about the things that he likes to do, but in the sentence he's not doing any of them, right? So even though I don't have it marked on my screen currently, essentially he is the subject, liked is the predicate or the verb, but then everything else isn't actually an object or anything like that. It's just, the rest of it's just a complete predicate. There's no objects in this sentence. All right, so that was the subject-object-predicate assignment. Make sure you submit that on Google Classroom, of course, once you're finished. If you feel like you made a couple errors or mistakes, of course, just go back onto Google Classroom, unsubmit it, and make a fix. The next thing that I had actually assigned after the subject-predicate-object assignment was a no red ink thing about identifying subjects. This assignment's relatively simple. It should only take you about 10 to 15 minutes. If you look on no red ink, it has several sections. There's, I believe, 6. There's 7, but they're all very simple because really all you're doing is reading the sentence and then clicking on the word that would actually be the subject. And a couple of them are just variations on a theme, like, okay, this time the subject actually has a name, and then later on it's like, well, sometimes a pronoun is the subject, which you also saw in the worksheet we were just looking at where it said he likes to blah, 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 right? So that's all it is. It's just one last quick review. It should not take you very long to do it. In fact, I would say that this assignment's actually easier than the assignment I gave you on Google Slides. All right, the next thing that we had on our list of things to do we were talking about plot pyramid when you guys were here in class. So we had 2 assignments that went along with that. One was the constructing our own plot pyramids, which we did in class. So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, it was when we did this plot diagram here and we watched the 2 videos. We watched the Coca-Cola commercial and the Leap of Faith one. Most of you already submitted that assignment, but please, if you forgot to submit it or you were like working on it and you didn't quite get it done, then please do make sure you get on that and submit that assignment. But remember, the only thing you had to do is give me the plot diagram. The videos are still online, so if you had missed that class, you weren't there, or you weren't able to stay the whole time or something like that, you can just click these links and find the video and watch it yourself. And then remember, you're just plotting out those clips. You're just saying, okay, if I had to give you the 5 points of a story based on what I saw, here's what I would tell you. Okay. The other thing, though, that we were working on as homework, and so now bear in mind, this is kind of new, so some of my classes did not get to see this in class. I said, hey, I do have some homework for you, but I'm going to put it on the video. So this is the part that you need right here. For those of you who missed or were not able to stay, if we didn't have enough time to go over this, the other thing that we are doing is a quick looking at a fairy tale and plotting it out. So it is a Google slide, and we'll have a look at that here in a second. Actually, it turns out that I already had opened it, but I guess I'll close this one. Okay, so what you're doing here is pretty simple. The plot pyramid's already set up for you for the first story, so you literally can just click and drag things over so that they're labeled. One thing that I'm going to give away is that on my own plot pyramid or diagram that I went over with you in class, we had the middle section, number 3, as theme, but for this assignment, we're actually going to make it conflict. So fortunately for this first one, I can just drag it over and put it into number 3, and we're good to go. Right, so I'm just telling you right ahead, number 3 right here is going to be asking you for the conflict of the story. And remember, if you look at the first assignment about plot diagram, I actually define all of these terms. I'll find that for you in a minute here. So what you're doing here is you're reading these 2 stories. One's the Little Red Riding Hood, and then the second one is Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. These are very short stories. They will not take you very long to read. And in fact, as you're reading them, you already have a purpose for reading. So if you look at this, I'm basically saying, hey, don't read this story for any other reason than to tell me how you would break down the plot here on this diagram. So this shouldn't be exceptionally challenging for you. And I know that sometimes we go, oh, well, I don't want to read a fairy tale. This is boring. And don't forget what we talked about, what it means to be more than just somebody who can read. We want to be a skillful reader. So a skillful reader finds a purpose first. They say, wait, why do I have to read this at all in the first place? Well, I've already given you a purpose. I want you to be able to tell me how the plot goes, which means that you should not be wasting your time reading every single last word as if they all depended on it. Like, oh my gosh, my life depends on remembering every detail. Oh my God, she has a red cloak. Okay. I mean, unless the story emphasizes that over and over and that's part of a pattern, then you really don't need to pay too much attention to that. What you're doing is just looking through this and saying, all right, how would I break this down plot-wise? And you're going to do the same thing with Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. Now, the funny thing about this assignment is that the Little Red Riding Hood assignment is actually written as kind of like a funny comedy. So they did what they call a fractured fairy tale, which means that it's part fairy tale, but then part modern stuff thrown in. So this one will actually be a more pleasant read for you because it has a couple jokes in there, and they switch roles around. Little Red Riding Hood isn't just a helpless flower, screaming for help or anything like that. They change it up. It's more interesting. However, when you get to the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood one, this one's written very straight and traditional. So I would say that it's actually quite boring. But remember, because I have a purpose for reading, when I get to the plot pyramid for Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, I don't have to panic here. I can just read through it and say, you know what, I'm only reading this because I have to be able to tell somebody the plot, so I'm not going to spend 30 minutes trying to digest this piece and enjoy it. I just need to read it to get the gist of it, and that's all I really want. Now, when you do the plot pyramid for Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, you will actually have to type out your own stuff. Sorry, that's just the way it's going to go. Now, one question that came up Monday or Tuesday with my Group A class was some folks were noticing that you're supposed to label the numbers here on the plot diagram, right? And we did this in class with the notes, like we talked about how number 1 is the exposition and so on and so forth. So the problem, of course, is that when you get to And here's the inciting incident number 2. So hey, I'm even giving answers away here if you didn't get these right? And then when I get to like number 4, I also talked about number 3 being conflict, but number 4 is like the rising action. But the problem, of course, is you put it here and it's not going the direction of the line. Well, nifty little trick. If you put your mouse right on this little antenna thing that's sticking out and you left click and you drag, boom, I can make it fit any direction that I need it to fit. And you can do that same thing on the other plot pyramid for Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. So I'll put this back here for a minute. If you go back here, actually I think the box is already set up for that. So yeah, the box is already set. But again, these little antenna things let you twist and turn them so that they're facing the correct angle that you want. All right. Now, the last question that it has you look at is this. It says, Little Red Riding Hood is a fractured fairy tale, which is a fairy tale that has changed in such a way as to make us laugh at unexpected characterization, plot developments, or modern language. The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood is a traditional fairy tale. Which plot details make it clear that Little Red Riding Hood is fractured and the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood is traditional? Use specific details from both of your stories in your response. So we talked about this in class with Group A. Group B, this is probably your first time seeing this. This question is very simple, and I'm not expecting you to type me this massive story. I really just want 4 or 5 sentences. All this question is really saying is that the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale, they call it fractured because it's written with modern stuff in it. So in case you don't really understand what that means, I mean that it's written with the kinds of morals and sensibilities that we all have. So for instance, Little Red Riding Hood is not what you call a damsel in distress or a woman that needs to be helped and saved by everybody. She actually has her own personality. She takes control of her surroundings and her environment, and she's clever and she does smart things, right? Whereas in most traditional fairy tales, unfortunately, and it's not that I agree with this, but in most traditional fairy tales, a female character is usually written as nothing more than a plot device. It's like, oh, princess gets captured, can't do anything for herself, needs a man to rescue her, right? So when you do the Little Red Riding Hood, just point out, give examples of modern stuff that they threw into the story. I mean, I think at one point they're like listening to an iPod or jamming to some music, and that's definitely not something that normal traditional fairy tales ever had because they were written in the past, in like the 1600s, when none of that existed, right? Now with the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, the question then becomes, well, how do I prove that this is traditional? Well, and as you know, I go back to the example I just said. In most traditional fairy tales, you have somebody who is completely helpless, they cannot save themselves, and they have to have like a fair prince or somebody else come in and rescue them. So just give any examples in the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood where it's constantly like, yep, here's Sleeping Beauty, she's helpless, or somebody has to step in on her behalf and save her, right? That would show that it's quite a traditional fairy tale. I mean, even the ones that we enjoy, that we're more familiar with, like say Cinderella, right? She gets the dress, but Cinderella, the entire story literally does nothing for herself in the traditional tale. It's like her fairy godmother has to come in and rescue. Well, this is the Disney version anyway, but even in the Disney version, they barely modernize it. Cinderella basically has to rely on a magic fairy to save her, and then she has to rely on a fair prince to take her out of her mean home. And essentially, Cinderella takes no action herself to get out of her situation. I mean, very traditional story. So again, you only need 4 or 5 sentences. If you wanted to know how to start it, you would literally just copy what the question asked you. You'd say, okay, first sentence, Little Red Riding Hood is a fractured fairy tale. One reason why it's fractured is because, and just give an example that makes it very modern. And then another reason why is because, and here's another modern example. And then Sleeping Beauty is a traditional fairy tale. And then next sentence, one reason is because, and then you just list that reason straight from the story. All right, so it should not be complicated. Just give me 2 quick examples for each. That's no more than 5 or 6 sentences at least. Okay, very simple. Okay, and then the very, very last thing that I wanted you to do over your week, because again, some of you I won't even see until next Thursday. So this is especially for Group B. Now with Group A, we had a lot of time left over. We were able to start this. But Group B, if you feel like this is a lot, please understand I'm not seeing you for like 7 days. So here's the last thing that I wanted you to do. So there's one last plot pyramid. And what it is I wanted you to watch a short film. It's no more than 5 minutes long. And it's actually a kind of spooky film. It's called Alma. And basically it features a little girl that sees a toy shop, and all of a sudden one day in the window a doll comes up that looks just like her, just randomly out of nowhere. She gets very curious, she decides to open the door and get inside to go find the doll, and then, well, you could probably guess the rest. But it's a pretty interesting story. Again, it's only 5 minutes. There's no dialogue, just some music and some sound, a lot of spooky sound. But it's a good film. Once you've watched it, you're going to do one last time. You just go ahead and you plot that thing out for me. Okay? All right, so that's that assignment. I know that was a lot there, but really, I mean, honestly, you're just reading a story and then saying, here, I can give you a summary based on the plot. That's all I'm asking you for. All right, so let's get back to our other stuff. So the one last big thing that we had going on, I believe, was that I needed you guys to start on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So I gave you an assignment here that basically is the actual story proper, and a few people, unfortunately, we got to this, but then we weren't able to like go over it or read it. A few people actually already turned it in for me, because this is essentially the same kind of assignment that we've already done twice, but I again will do one page with you and show you what you needed to do, and as long as you follow along with this video, you should be fine. All right, so with this assignment, what you were doing is pretty simple. This time, as we read the story, you are highlighting evidence from the text that reveals information about the historical context. And the reason why we had started talking about plot pyramid was because we also were discussing exposition, or the setting, which is the beginning of any story. And we discussed how the setting is actually a very, very important factor in any story. So for instance, like if I run up the stairs after lunch or something and I say, oh my God, 2 people got into a fight with each other, right? You get excited about that, but I could ruin my story if I change my setting and say, yeah, they got into a fight at the boxing ring. Well, now my story is not exciting anymore, because in that kind of setting, you would just say, well, duh, people fight at the boxing rings all the time. That's not a special, that's just a Tuesday. I mean, what's remarkable about that? Right? So a setting is more than just, well, we were here and it doesn't matter. It's like, no. The setting is what sets our expectations for what we should be seeing in a story. If I tell you that my story is set in space, but then as you read my story, it does nothing but talk about selling ice cream, you're going to think that my story is weird. It's like, well, why are you in space selling ice cream? And then if I don't make it interesting, you'll be like, oh, I don't know, that was just weird, right? Or, I decide that I'm going to do a story that's set in the ocean, but it features ninjas. You'd be like, well, what do ninjas have to do with the ocean? Why are they in the ocean to begin with? That's not... The Ninja Turtles did, they lived in the sewer. That's as far, that's about as close to water as they got. Ninjas and water don't mix. Right? So the idea is that when I'm reading this text and I'm trying to highlight for evidence that reveals historical context, what I'm really doing is I'm looking and saying, okay, are there any clues or hints that let me understand why Frederick Douglass's story is going the way that it does? So let's go ahead and read, and I'll start indicating what I'm talking about, and then you'll highlight and actually mark for those things. So here we go, chapter 5. So this is just an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's story. Remember, Frederick Douglass was an actual real person. He was a former slave who ended up gaining his freedom in his older age. Well, he wasn't that old when he got freedom, but in his older age, he fought for the freedoms of others. And as we read this, we're not, again, because we have a purpose for the text, we're not reading this because we're trying to become experts on Frederick Douglass's life, which means that we do not need to, read this so hard that our eyes bleed. We're just reading and we're going, okay, I just need to find historical context, meaning stuff that is not from my world that I can show and say, this is telling me why his life was like this. It makes sense now. All right, so let's read. Chapter 5. As to my own treatment while I lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, it was very similar to that of the other slave children. I was not old enough to work in the field, and there being little else than field work to do, I had a great deal of leisure time. The most I had to do was to drive up the cows at evening, keep the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run of errands for my old master's daughter, Mrs. Lucretia Auld. The most of my leisure time I spent in helping Master Daniel Lloyd in finding his birds, after he had shot them. My connection with Master Daniel was of some advantage to me. He became quite attached to me, and was a sort of protector of me. He would not allow the older boys to impose upon me, and would divide his cakes with me. All right, cool. So as we read that, because again, I'm looking for historical context, I'm looking for stuff that I see or hear that I go, oh, yeah, we don't do that anymore. That's not our world. So right off the bat, it's like Colonel Lloyd's plantation. No, we don't do that anymore. I mean, I'm not trying to say that there's no such thing as a plantation on this planet. There are places that you could still consider a plantation, and hopefully they don't still use slaves. But still, that's kind of something that's not really in our time, especially locally for us. Like, nobody here in Washington goes, oh yeah, I'm just going to the local plantation today. It doesn't happen. Or at least I hope it still doesn't happen. You never know these days, right? Anyway, it was very similar to that of other slave children. So once again, another historical context where I go, all right, this is not from my time. This is not my world. So this is historical. This is something that's letting me know and understand what Frederick Douglass's life was like, or at least as he tells me this story about how he has to like fetch things for people, I go, oh, okay, this is making sense because he's on a plantation and there's slave children. So I'm not happy about it, but I understand now why he has this life, right? Okay, field work. Not that people don't work in the fields anymore, but this idea that a kid is out in the fields doing work for other people, that's historical. He calls somebody Master Daniel Lloyd. I mean, I don't know about you guys. Actually, I'm pretty darn sure you guys don't call anybody Master unless you're, say, in martial arts or something like that. Because I know a few martial arts schools, like they have their coaches called Master. But yeah, that's something that, again, not really in our world or something like that. So if I wanted to, so again, we're doing our same pattern where we make 2 comments on the side of the things that we highlighted. We like sum something up. So in this case, my historical context could be very simple. I'm going to highlight there, and then don't forget we make a comment right up here where we hit this plus, and I'll just say, that he lives on a plantation and he works with other slaves. So there, I'm highlighting evidence of historical context here. I mentioned that, actually I could get 2 things out of that right off the bat, even before I even get through the rest of this. So the other comment I can make is, we'll make another comment. Calls adults by the name, by the name of Master. So again, this is another historical context, because like, it's not that we don't give people respectful titles like Mr. and Ms. and Miss. I mean, we do that in school all the time. But I mean, this Daniel Lloyd guy was literally his owner, his master. And so again, that gives us historical context, meaning background information that doesn't really fit our own time, but helps us understand why he lived the life that he lived. Right now, if I were to read his story and he were to tell me that he had a hard life, but instead of having plantations and slaves and masters, if he instead said, oh yeah, and I was always at the beach and everybody was serving me hand and foot and I went surfing every other day, but oh man, what a hard life I led, I'd be like, okay, this story is ridiculous. This makes no sense, right? So this is why we are talking about exposition or setting and historical context. They're very important because otherwise a story doesn't make sense to us. We have to understand. We need something to show us that, like, yeah, this story jives. There's a reason my life was hard. Look, here's the history behind it that you can see and go, all right, yeah, he had it pretty hard, right? Now, obviously, I could be done with this page if I wanted to be, because I already got my 2 historical contexts. But let's continue reading on. The other things that I could have highlighted: I was seldom whipped by my older master, right? Oh, there's one, right? Oh my gosh, geez, right? I don't know. I'm hoping people aren't still being whipped today. And suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. Little from anything else but hunger and cold. Again, the fact that he considers that like a minor inconvenience. And in his time, it's like, yeah, in his time, that probably was a minor inconvenience, because as you guys pretty much know, a lot of times slaves would just be killed or tortured to death or worked to death or something like that. So I guess, yeah, in his mind, having little hunger pains was the least of his worries. So again, even those 2 examples alone could have given me a historical context. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In the hottest summer and coldest winter, I kept almost naked. No shoes. Okay, so here's this, right? I mean, I know that people in today's world still suffer in those cases of like, not having heat in the house, or maybe not having a jacket or something like that. But if you look at his, it's particularly extreme. It goes a little bit further than what we're even used to, where it's like, okay, no shoes at all, no stockings, no jacket, like no pants. Like, come on. All right, this is getting ridiculous, right? So again, more historical context. Reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. Okay, so again, I know that some people unfortunately still in today's time sometimes don't have a bed either. But I mean, if you're looking at this is getting extreme. I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill, and I would crawl into this bag and there sleep on the floor. Oh my gosh, right? So every paragraph is just oozing with historical context that I could have used here. Right? So I'm not going to read much more because I don't want this video to go on forever. And look, I even highlighted almost too much. I mean, you really, for this assignment, I'm not requiring you to highlight as much as I did, because you're just doing 2 examples per page. But as you go through here, I mean, you can see just like, oh my gosh, how much stuff there is. So you're doing the same thing for the other pages here. Remember, as you're reading, you're not reading it because you're trying to memorize it. You're not reading it because you're supposed to have a love of literature, right? It's not that. You're reading it and you're looking for specifically, you're giving me stuff where it's like, okay, what stuff appears here that goes beyond what we're doing today, where it's like, yeah, that's history, that's stuff from the past, that's stuff that, sure, we might see shades of it in today's world because, yeah, racism and stuff isn't dead, but like he's got a way more extreme version of it. So I want you to be highlighting those and then making at least 2 comments on the side where you tell me in quick summary, like, okay, here's the stuff that he went through that fortunately and unfortunately are historical, meaning we're not really doing that, or even if it is happening, 99% of the population is at least behind the idea that it's just flat out wrong. Okay, and then after that you go ahead and you submit it. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers most of it. I mean, everything else is something that we had done in class. Just again, when you're checking on Google Classroom, please look at all the assignments that we had done together and make sure that you actually had submitted it, especially the assignments that we did together, because there was a number that we finished in class, but you may have forgotten to submit them. All right, so this is Mr. Olson telling you to have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week.